I was wrapping a bandage around Mr. Collins' arm when Clara rushed into the room, her face pale and eyes wide. Her apron was smeared with flour. She'd been baking bread for the children. "Caddy," she panted, clutching the doorframe. "There's someone lying in the forest. He looks hurt." I froze for a moment, the roll of bandages slipping from my hand. "What do you mean lying in the forest?" Clara nodded quickly. "One of the farmers passing by saw him. He's near the old oak tree." Without wasting time, I grabbed my medical kit and called for a few of the older boys to come along. The forest wasn't too far from the orphanage, but it wasn't a place anyone visited casually. The trees were dense, their branches twisting together like locked fingers, and rumors of wild animals had been circulating in town. When we arrived, I saw him. A man sprawled on the damp ground, face down, his clothes stained with blood. His shirt was torn, and dark streaks covered his sleeves. For a moment, fear pricked at me. Was he alive? I knelt beside him, my fingers trembling as I pressed them to his neck. A pulse, steady and strong. Relief swept through me. "He's unconscious, but he's alive," I told the others. "Let's get him back to the orphanage." The boys helped me lift him onto a makeshift stretcher. Even in his state, I couldn't help but notice how striking he looked. Sharp jawline, dark hair falling across his forehead, and a physique that hinted at strength. But I shook the thought away. He was hurt, and that was all that mattered. Back at the orphanage, we placed him on a cot in the infirmary. I rolled up my sleeves, ready to clean his wounds, but as I began dabbing at the blood on his shirt, something didn't add up. There were no cuts, no injuries, just blood. I leaned back, puzzled, and stared at his face. Who was this man? And why was he covered in blood if he wasn't hurt? Before I could think further, his eyelids fluttered open. His eyes, intense, almost predatory, locked onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, he sat up, brushed off his shirt, and swung his legs over the side of the cot. "You're awake," I said, breaking the silence. He didn't respond. Instead, he stood, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a wolf stalking its prey. Without even a glance of gratitude, he walked out. I was stunned. "You're welcome," I muttered under my breath, irritation bubbling up. His attitude grated on me, but I let it go. People in need were my priority, not their manners. The next evening, as I was walking back from the market, I saw a sleek black car pull up beside me. The window rolled down, and there he was, the same man. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice deep but casual. I hesitated. "You don't even say thank you when someone saves your life, and now you're offering rides?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'm Xavier," he said. "And I didn't thank you yesterday because I wasn't exactly in my best form. So, thank you." His tone was sincere, and I found myself softening. With a small nod, I got into the car. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space. Then he spoke. "You live at the orphanage?" "Yes," I replied. "I work there as a senior caretaker. It's my home." He glanced at me briefly before turning his attention back to the road. "That's admirable." When we reached the orphanage, I thanked him and stepped out. He leaned out the window. "I meant it. Thank you for helping me." I smiled faintly. "I was expecting that appreciation yesterday." He chuckled softly, then drove away. The next morning, I woke up early and got to work. Breakfast for the kids, bathing schedules, and lunch prep. It was a routine I loved. The laughter of the children filled the air, a sound that always warmed my soul. Later, As I sat with a newspaper, a headline caught my eye. Wild animal sighted in the forest. Residents warned to stay alert. A shiver ran down my spine. Was it connected to Xavier? The thought lingered in my mind, but I had no proof. That afternoon, Xavier arrived at the orphanage with boxes of food, fresh fruits, bread, and other treats for the kids. The children swarmed around him, their laughter echoing through the halls as he played games and lifted them in the air. I watched from the doorway, smiling at the sight. When he caught my eye, he walked over. "It's the least I could do," he said, his tone softer than I'd ever heard. "Thank you," I replied. Over the next few weeks, Xavier became a regular visitor. He never talked about his family, and I never pried, but our conversations grew longer and more personal. I told him about my life, how I'd lost my parents in a car accident last year, how the orphanage had become my sanctuary, and how I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. He listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're incredible," he said one evening as we sat on the orphanage steps. I shrugged. "I just do what I can." We started going out together. Clubs, restaurants, quiet walks in the park. There was an unspoken connection between us, but I kept my feelings buried. My life was here, with these children. I couldn't afford to dream of anything else. Still, every time he smiled at me or laughed at one of my jokes, a warmth spread through me. And when he looked at me, it felt like he saw a part of me I didn't even know existed, but something about him remained a mystery. In the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that Xavier was hiding something dark. It was a calm afternoon, and the sun streamed through the windows of the orphanage, casting golden streaks on the wooden floors. I was sitting in the common room, reading to the children when Clara came in, her voice hushed. "Catty," she said, motioning me over, "there's a man here to see you." I stood, smoothing my dress and walking toward the entrance. A tall man with a rugged face and sharp eyes waited near the door. His jacket was frayed at the edges, and his hands were clasped tightly, like he was bracing himself for an argument. "Miss Catty," he began, his voice steady but low. "My name is Taylor. I need to warn you about Xavier." His words made my stomach twist. "Warn me?" I asked, crossing my arms. "What are you talking about?" Taylor stepped closer, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. "Xavier isn't who you think he is. He's a dangerous man, and I've known him long enough to say that with certainty. You should keep your distance." The sincerity in his tone unnerved me, but I couldn't let myself jump to conclusions. "If you have proof, I'd like to see it," I replied coolly. "I don't have proof," he admitted. "But you'll see it for yourself if you look closely enough. Just be careful." He tipped his hat and left without another word. I was unsettled, but I couldn't let myself believe him just like that. Still, the thought lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Xavier more closely. Whenever we were together, I paid attention to every detail. The way he spoke, the places he went, the people he met. I even followed him on occasion, though I hated myself for it. One evening, I saw him walking into the woods alone, his stride purposeful, and his expression unreadable. Something was off. Why did he always seem to have secrets? Despite my doubts, we continued to spend time together. Xavier had a way of making me laugh, of making me forget my worries, even for a little while. But no matter how close we grew, I never let myself lose sight of my responsibilities. The orphanage was my life, and the children needed me more than I needed anyone else. One evening, as we sat by the river under the fading light of the sunset, Xavier turned to me. His dark eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw vulnerability in him. "Caddy," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stand still for a moment. I stared at him, my mind racing. His words were everything I'd dreamed of hearing, but they felt like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. "I can't," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His brows furrowed. "Why not?" "I have responsibilities, Xavier. The orphanage is my home, my life. I've made a promise to these children, and I can't abandon them." "You wouldn't have to abandon them," he argued, leaning closer. "We could make it work." I shook my head. "It's not that simple, and—" I hesitated, thinking of Taylor's warning. "I'm not sure I know everything about you." Xavier's face fell, the disappointment clear in his eyes. He didn't say another word. He just stood, nodded once, and walked away. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't see or hear from Xavier. He stopped visiting the orphanage, stopped calling, stopped showing up in the places we used to meet. A part of me ached for him, but I told myself it was for the best. Even as I went about my day, cooking, cleaning, playing with the children, my thoughts drifted to him. I missed his laugh, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. But I had made my choice, and I had to live with it. One evening, as I was closing up the kitchen, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Xavier standing there, his expression a mix of desperation and determination. "I can't live without you, Caddy," he said, his voice raw. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the door. "Xavier, we've talked about this." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I don't care. I'll do whatever it takes to be with you." Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me. His touch was electric, and for a moment I forgot everything. Taylor's warning, my responsibilities, my doubts. I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his shirt. When we finally pulled away, he smiled softly, but I took a step back. "This can't happen," I said firmly. "I'm sorry, Xavier, but I've made my decision. I can't marry you. I can't even see you anymore." His smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet pain. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," I replied. As I turned to walk away, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Someone was watching us. I spun around, but whoever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. "Did you see that?" I asked Xavier. He glanced around, his jaw tightening. "No. Let me walk you back." I shook my head. "I'll be fine." On my way back to the orphanage, I saw a woman standing near the gate, her arms crossed as if she'd been waiting for me. "Caddy?" she called out, her voice sharp. I stopped, my heart sinking as she approached. "I'm Jasmine," she said, her eyes blazing. "Xavier's wife." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "What?" She pulled out her phone and showed me photo after photo. Xavier and her together, smiling in their home, on vacations, at parties. "I saw you two," she said coldly. "I saw you kissing him." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "I didn't know," I whispered. "He never told me he was married. I swear, Jasmine. I'm so sorry." Her expression softened slightly, but the anger didn't leave her eyes. "You should know something else," she added. "Xavier isn't just my husband. He's a werewolf. A dangerous one. He hunts people, Caddy. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? It's true, she insisted. Stay away from him. For your own safety. I nodded slowly, my mind spinning. I won't see him again. You have my word. Jasmine nodded, her face unreadable, and walked away. When I returned to the orphanage, I felt hollow but resolute. Xavier wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't the man I needed. I buried myself in my work, finding solace in the laughter of the children and the comfort of routine. Xavier had left a mark on me, but I was strong enough to heal. My life was here, and I wouldn't let anything or anyone take that away from me. I was in the garden of the orphanage, trimming the overgrown rose bushes. The morning sun had just started to peek through the clouds, and the air smelled faintly of earth and dew. The children's laughter echoed from the play area, filling the space with warmth. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then I saw him. Xavier stood at the gate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His dark eyes found mine, and his expression was unreadable. I straightened, gripping the pruning shears a little tighter. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut through the peaceful morning. He pushed the gate open and stepped in, his movements slow and deliberate. "I had to see you, Caddy," he said softly. I set the shears down and crossed my arms. "You shouldn't be here." He closed the distance between us, his gaze unwavering. "I can't let things end like this. I want to be with you. I need you." Before I could stop myself, my hand flew up, and the sound of the slap echoed louder than I expected. Xavier's head turned with the impact, but he didn't move away. I didn't say a word. I just turned and started walking back toward the orphanage, my footsteps firm on the gravel path. "Wait!" he called out, his voice breaking slightly. "Caddy, please!" I stopped but didn't turn around. I could hear him moving closer, his tone desperate now. "I know Jasmine came to see you. I know what she told you. But you have to hear my side." "Your side?" I repeated, finally turning to face him. "You lied to me, Xavier. You're married. Do you even realize how wrong that is?" "I know," he admitted, his shoulders sagging. "I know I should have told you. But I was scared, Caddy. I was scared of losing you." I let out a bitter laugh. "And lying to me was supposed to make me stay? Do you even hear yourself?" He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "It's not like that. My marriage with Jasmine, it's nothing. It's been nothing for years. She doesn't understand me. She never has. But you—" He took a step closer, his voice softening. "You're different. You see me for who I really am." I shook my head, feeling a wave of disappointment wash over me. "You don't get it, do you? I don't need you, Xavier. I'm strong. I'm independent. I've built my life around helping others, not chasing after men who keep secrets." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I've changed, Caddy. I used to hunt, yes, but I don't do that anymore. Not since I met you." My gaze hardened. "Jasmine told me everything. She told me you're a werewolf, a dangerous one. Do you know what it felt like to hear that from her, instead of from you?" He flinched but didn't deny it. "I was going to tell you. I didn't know how." "That's not good enough," I said firmly. "You hid who you are. You hid your marriage. And now you expect me to just forget all of that because you love me?" "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice raw. "But everything I did was because I love you." I took a step back, crossing my arms again. Love isn't about hiding things, Xavier. It's about trust. And you broke that. He reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped further away. "Don't come back here," I said quietly. "Don't contact me again." "Caddy." "No," I interrupted, my voice steady. "This is over." I turned and walked back to the orphanage without looking back. Later that afternoon, I was sitting in the common room, sorting through donations. Clara was helping me fold clothes, and the sound of the children playing outside drifted through the open windows. I was beginning to feel like myself again. "Caddy, someone's here to see you," Clara said suddenly, pointing toward the doorway. I looked up and saw Taylor standing there, his arms crossed and a faint smirk on his face. I let out a sigh, setting the clothes aside. "What do you want, Taylor?" I asked, standing up. "I just wanted to say I'm glad you've come to your senses," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Breaking things off with Xavier was the right move." I frowned. "How do you know about that?" His smirk widened slightly. "Let's just say I've got my ways." I crossed my arms, studying him. "How do you know Xavier, Taylor?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm part of his pack. We've known each other for years." I felt a jolt of anger. "So you're just like him?" "Not exactly," he said quickly. "I left the pack a long time ago. I don't hunt anymore. But I've kept an eye on things. And when I saw the way Xavier was acting around you, I thought you deserved to know the truth." I shook my head, feeling a wave of exhaustion. "I don't want to talk about Xavier. Not with you, not with anyone. So if that's all you came here for, you can leave." Taylor raised his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Fair enough. But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." I didn't respond, and after a moment, he turned and walked away. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. Xavier and his world were behind me now. I had my own life, my own purpose, and I wasn't going to let anyone or anything distract me from that again. The children's laughter filled the air once more, grounding me in the present. I smiled faintly and returned to my work, ready to move forward. It had been a long morning. I'd spent hours picking up groceries for the orphanage, haggling over prices with vendors at the market, and making sure I got the best deals on fresh produce. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon by the time I started walking back, my shopping bags heavier than I expected, but full of everything we needed for the week. The path back to the orphanage was quiet, lined with trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The faint smell of pine hung in the air, mixing with the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. I was enjoying the calm when I saw them. At first, it was just Taylor. He was leaning casually against a tree, his hands in his pockets, and a faint smirk on his face. He looked like he didn't have a care in the world, the kind of guy who could charm anyone with a few well-placed words. But then I noticed the woman standing in front of him, Jasmine. I froze, instinctively stepping behind a cluster of trees. My grip on the shopping bags tightened as I peered through the branches, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Jasmine was dressed impeccably, as always, her hair pulled back neatly and her posture stiff. She was saying something to Taylor, but I couldn't hear what. At first, I thought maybe they were just friends. They seemed to be having an intense conversation, though Jasmine's face betrayed little emotion. Taylor, on the other hand, was smiling faintly, his body language relaxed. He leaned closer to her, and for a moment, I considered walking away. But then it happened. Taylor tilted his head slightly and kissed her. My breath caught, and I had to stop myself from gasping out loud. Jasmine didn't pull away, but she didn't kiss him back, her hands lightly resting on his arms. I stepped back, my pulse quickening, my thoughts racing. What was going on? Jasmine was Xavier's wife, wasn't she? And Taylor, Taylor had acted like he was on my side, warning me about Xavier. The bags in my hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I turned and walked away as quietly as I could, my mind spinning. Back at the orphanage, I tried to focus on putting away the groceries and checking in on the kids, but the image of Taylor and Jasmine stayed with me. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. Whatever it was, something wasn't right. The morning started like any other. The children were bright-eyed and brimming with energy, their giggles filling the orphanage as we played tag in the courtyard. I had just crouched down to tie little Sarah's shoelace when Nurse Clara walked toward me, her hands clasped tightly together. Her expression was calm but held a trace of concern. "Miss Caddy," she said, her voice soft. "Someone is here to see you." I straightened up, brushing the dirt off my knees. "Who is it?" "She said her name is Jasmine," Clara replied. The name felt like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through my thoughts. I nodded, masking the mixture of curiosity and irritation swirling inside me. "All right, I'll be there." Leaving the children behind, I made my way toward the hall. Each step felt deliberate, as though my body was bracing for an encounter I wasn't quite ready for. When I entered, Jasmine was standing by the window, her back to me. She was wearing a navy blue coat, her blonde hair falling neatly over her shoulders. She turned the moment she heard my footsteps, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Jasmine," I said simply. "Caddy," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to talk to you." I crossed my arms, keeping my tone even. "What is it this time?" She stepped closer, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared? Why?" I asked, frowning. "It's Taylor," she said, her eyes darting to the floor. "He's angry, and I think he might hurt me." Her words took me by surprise, though I didn't show it. "Why is Taylor angry with you?" She hesitated, biting her lower lip as if searching for the right words. "It was Taylor who told me about you and Xavier. He was the one who told me where you two were that night at the restaurant." I tilted my head, my voice laced with disbelief. "Why would he do that?" "He wasn't helping me," she said quickly, her words tumbling out. "He has his own reasons. Taylor, he wants to marry me." My eyebrows shot up. "He wants to marry you?" Jasmine nodded, her eyes wide. "Yes. He kissed me. It caught me off guard, but I told him I love Xavier. I rejected him." I raised a hand, stopping her. "Wait a second. I saw you two. That day, in the woods. He kissed you, and you didn't push him away." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down. I was shocked. It happened so fast. But I told him afterward that I didn't feel the same way." "And now he's angry," I said, piecing it together. "Yes," she whispered. "Taylor is furious. He said if I don't marry him and help him, he'll kill me." Her voice wavered on the last word, and I could see the genuine fear in her eyes. It was unsettling, but I forced myself to stay composed. "What does he want you to help him with?" I asked, though I was already beginning to suspect the answer. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "He wants to be the alpha," she finally said. "He wants to get rid of Xavier." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "Of course he does. And you told him no, so now you're his target." "I didn't just tell him no," she said quickly. "I told him I love Xavier. I couldn't betray him like that." I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. Her fear seemed real enough, but the situation was tangled. "So let me get this straight," I said. "Taylor wants you to betray your husband and marry him, all so he can take Xavier's place as alpha. And when you said no, he threatened your life?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. I crossed my arms again, leaning back slightly. "Jasmine, this is a lot. I don't know what you expect me to do about it." "I don't know either," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know who else to turn to." For a moment, I didn't say anything. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I could feel the tension creeping into my thoughts. Finally, I spoke. "Jasmine, I get that you're scared," I said. "But this isn't my fight. I have enough on my plate as it is." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me with an intensity that caught me off guard. "Caddy, you're stronger than you realize. You're the only one who can help me." I shook my head. "I can't get involved in this. I've worked too hard to leave all that behind." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "But you're already involved, Caddy. Whether you like it or not, you're part of this now." Her words struck a nerve, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I held her gaze, unflinching. "I'll think about it," I said finally. Jasmine said, "One more thing." I asked, "What?" She said, "Only you can help me." I sat at my desk in the orphanage's quiet study room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan filling the space. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the floor. Jasmine sat across from me, her posture stiff, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her coat. "I think you're mistaken," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I can't do anything to help you. Taylor is a werewolf, and I'm just a human." Her eyes darted up to meet mine, a flicker of defiance behind the fear. "No, Caddy," she said firmly. "You're not just human. You're different." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "Different? What are you talking about?" She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, leaning forward slightly, she spoke in a quiet, deliberate tone. "I know you're a shifter." My breath hitched, and I froze, staring at her. The room seemed to shrink around us. "What the hell are you talking about?" I finally said, my voice low but sharp. "I know your secret," she continued, her voice unwavering now. "I know what you are, and I know what happened a few years ago. The accident." The mention of the accident sent a wave of unease through me, memories I had buried deep clawing their way back to the surface. My jaw tightened. "How do you know about that?" Her eyes softened, a hint of sadness creeping into her expression. "The man you injured that night, he was my father." For a moment, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. I stared at her, trying to process her words. "Your father?" She nodded, her voice quieter now. "Yes, he survived the attack, but he was never the same. He told me everything before he passed." I ran a hand through my hair, standing up and pacing the room. I didn't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for your loss, Jasmine. Truly. But I've worked so hard to leave that life behind. I've built something here. Something good." "I understand," she said, her gaze following me as I moved. "But I don't have anywhere else to turn. I'm desperate, Caddy." I stopped pacing, turning to face her. "And what exactly do you expect me to do? Fight Taylor? That's insane." "You could defeat him," she said, her voice steady, almost pleading. You're stronger than you realize. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. You don't know what you're asking. I've spent years trying to forget what I am. I chose this life because it's safe, peaceful. But it's not just about you anymore, she said, standing now and taking a step toward me. Taylor is dangerous. He wants to be alpha, and he'll stop at nothing to get there. He's already threatened me. And Xavier? Xavier can take care of himself, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Maybe, she said, her voice softening. But Taylor won't stop with Xavier. You know that as well as I do. I turned away, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The orphanage grounds were quiet now, the children inside for the night. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. I've worked too hard to become the person I am now, Jasmine. I can't just throw all of that away. She stepped closer, her voice filled with urgency. I know you've changed, Caddy. I can see it. But that strength, that power, it's still a part of you. And right now, it's the only thing that can stop Taylor. I turned to face her, my expression guarded. And if I agree to this, what happens then? Do I go back to being the person I was? The person who hurt people? Her eyes met mine, sincere and steady. No, she said. You've already proven you're not that person anymore. This isn't about revenge or violence. It's about protecting the people you care about, and yourself. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I felt a knot forming in my chest, a mixture of fear, anger, and something I couldn't quite name. I don't know, I said finally, my voice barely audible. I need time to think. She nodded, pulling a piece of paper from her bag and handing it to me. Here's my number, she said. Please, Caddy, just think about it. Call me if you decide, if you're willing to help. I took the paper, my fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. Her hand was cold, trembling slightly. As she turned to leave, I watched her go, her figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. The sound of her footsteps echoed as she walked away, leaving me alone in the study. I stared at the piece of paper in my hand, the numbers blurring together as my thoughts raced. Jasmine's plea had stirred something in me, something I had spent years trying to bury. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my past pressing against my present, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what I chose, my life was about to change forever. The sun dipped low, casting a soft amber glow over the trees as I waited for Xavier. The chill in the evening air tugged at the edges of my coat, but my focus was sharp. I needed to talk to him, not as a lover, but as someone caught in the middle of a storm that wasn't entirely her own. Xavier approached from the woods, his figure shadowed by the towering pines. His face lit up when he saw me, that familiar warmth in his eyes, stirring something I wasn't ready to deal with. He wore a black leather jacket over a plain shirt and jeans, his usual rugged look. Caddy, he said, his voice steady but tinged with something softer. I was hoping to see you. I didn't waste time. Xavier, I need your help, I said, crossing my arms. This isn't about us, it's about Jasmine. His brows furrowed. Jasmine? What's going on? She came to me, I explained, keeping my voice calm but firm. She's scared. Taylor's been threatening her, and she's afraid he might attack. Xavier's jaw tightened. Taylor, I should have known. That snake. There's more, I said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. I saw him kissing Jasmine. He blinked, the words clearly catching him off guard. What? Jasmine? She didn't want it, Xavier, I clarified. She told me he kissed her, and she rejected him. She loves you, even if... My voice faltered for a second, but I quickly recovered. Even if this whole situation is a mess. Xavier took a step closer, his eyes searching mine.
Caddy, you need to know something. I
raised a hand to stop him.
Don't. This isn't the time for that. But I need to say it,
he insisted, his voice dropping to a near whisper.
I love you, Caddy. I always have.
I looked away, the words cutting deeper than I cared to admit. Xavier, this isn't about us. Jasmine needs help. She came to me because she's desperate, and I can't just turn my back on her. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, I'll help, but on one condition. Jasmine leaves me after this, for good. I stared at him, disbelief and disappointment bubbling under the surface. You can't make that decision for her. It's her life, Xavier, not yours.
She's my wife,
he countered, his tone firm but not unkind. And that's the problem, I said, taking a step back. You're asking for my help, but you're still trying to control her. I'll help Jasmine, but I won't promise anything about her choices. That's up to her. Xavier looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly.
Fair enough. What's the plan?
I hesitated, the weight of my next words hanging heavily. There's something you don't know about me, I said finally. His eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity replacing some of the tension.
What is it?
I'm not just human, I said, meeting his gaze head on. I'm a shifter. He froze, his surprise evident.
You're a...
Yes, I interrupted. I kept it hidden for a reason, Xavier. I've worked hard to leave that part of my life behind. But this is different. He nodded slowly, processing the revelation.
I never would have guessed,
he said, almost to himself. Good, I replied. That means I've done my job. I outlined the plan quickly. I'll confront Taylor tonight. You'll stay hidden in the trees, and if things go sideways, you step in, but only if it's absolutely necessary. You're going alone? He asked, concern flashing in his eyes. I can handle myself, I said, my voice steady. But I'm not stupid. That's why you're my backup. He nodded again, his expression serious.
Understood.
As the plan settled between us, I pulled out my phone and called Jasmine. She picked up after the second ring, her voice shaky but hopeful. Caddy? She said. I'll help you, I said, keeping my tone neutral. But there's something I need from you. What is it? She asked hesitantly. You need to leave Xavier, I said, the words feeling heavier than they should. After this is over, you have to walk away. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her breathing on the other end. If that's what it takes, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You agree? I asked, surprised by how easily she accepted. Yes, she said, though there was no mistaking the sadness in her voice. But it's not what I want. Jasmine, this isn't about what anyone wants, I said, my tone softening. It's about survival. She was silent for a moment, then said, Thank you, Caddy. I'll do whatever you need. When the call ended, I looked at Xavier. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. You really are clever, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. I'm just doing what needs to be done, I replied. As we stood there in the fading light, the weight of the night ahead pressed on both of us. I didn't know what would happen when I faced Taylor, But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Jasmine or Xavier anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could still stand tall, even when the past threatened to pull me down. The forest was still, its usual whispers replaced by the faint rustle of leaves under my cautious steps. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the clearing where I knew Taylor would be. I stayed low, my breath steady as I moved closer. The weight of what I was about to do settled in my chest like a stone, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford hesitation tonight. Through the shadows, I spotted him. Taylor crouched near a rabbit, his movements precise, his predatory instincts sharp. He hadn't noticed me yet, which gave me the perfect opening. I let my shifter instincts take over, my muscles tensing as my senses sharpened. Then, like a coiled spring, I lunged. My attack was swift. I aimed for his side, landing a solid blow that sent him stumbling. Taylor snarled, his surprise quickly replaced by rage. His eyes glinted in the moonlight as he turned to face me, his form already shifting. He was massive, his werewolf body towering over mine. But I stood my ground, matching his ferocity. We clashed, claws and teeth tearing through the night. Taylor was stronger than I anticipated, each of his attacks calculated and vicious. But I held my own, using my agility to evade his strikes and land my own. For a moment, I thought I had the upper hand. Then I felt it, a shift in the air behind me. Before I could react, a force slammed into my side, knocking me to the ground. I rolled quickly, my instinct saving me as claws raked the spot where I'd just been. I looked up and froze. Jasmine. But she wasn't Jasmine anymore. Her human form was gone, replaced by the sleek, menacing figure of a werewolf. She bared her teeth at me, her golden eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Betrayal? Guilt? None of it mattered as she lunged at me again. The two of them worked together seamlessly. Taylor's brute strength and Jasmine's speed made them a dangerous pair, and I was barely keeping up. Each blow they landed sent pain coursing through me, and each strike I threw felt weaker than the last. They were overpowering me, and I knew I wouldn't last much longer. Just as I felt the fight slipping out of my hands, a blur shot out from the trees. Xavier. He crashed into Taylor with the force of a hurricane, his roar echoing through the forest. The two of them tumbled away, leaving me face to face with Jasmine. Her hesitation was brief, but I caught it. For a split second, she faltered, and I used the opportunity to strike. The fight became a whirlwind. Xavier and Taylor tore into each other, their snarls and growls blending with the sounds of the forest. Jasmine and I circled each other, both of us wary and wounded. She struck first, but I countered, landing a blow that sent her staggering. With Xavier by my side, the tide began to turn. We worked together, our movements in sync despite everything. Taylor and Jasmine fought fiercely, but their aggression wasn't enough to match our determination. Blow after blow, we drove them back until they had no choice but to retreat. Taylor let out a furious snarl, his form retreating as he grabbed Jasmine. She glanced back at me, her golden eyes filled with a mix of anger and something else. Regret, maybe? Then they disappeared into the shadows, leaving Xavier and me alone in the clearing. The silence that followed was deafening. My body ached, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I looked around. The forest seemed different now, darker and heavier. I glanced at Xavier, his chest rising and falling as he shifted back to his human form. His face was a mix of exhaustion and shock. I felt the same. Jasmine. A werewolf. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The betrayal. The lies. It all swirled in my mind like a storm. But one thought stood out above the rest. I had survived. We had survived. And as I stood there, bruised and bloodied, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of pride. I had been clever enough to plan for this, to bring Xavier as my backup even when I didn't fully trust him, and that decision had saved my life. The moonlight still clung to the night as Xavier and I stood on the edge of the clearing, our breath visible in the cool air. The fight with Taylor and Jasmine was over, but its shadows lingered heavily in my mind. "Did you get it?" I asked, my voice steady, though my thoughts were anything but. Xavier turned to me, his brows pulling together in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Talking." "Jasmine," I said firmly. "She wasn't there to protect herself. She was planning to end me." I paused, searching his face for understanding. "She loves you, doesn't she? Or, she says she does. Maybe she thought if I were gone, she'd finally have you to herself. But we're already separated. Why would she still want me out of the picture?" Xavier exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his expression darker than the forest around us. "I've been thinking about that. It's not about me. At least, not the way we thought. Jasmine doesn't care about me." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "You were her husband, Xavier. She made it clear that she wanted you." He shook his head, a bitter edge in his voice. "She doesn't love me, Caddy. I see that now. Maybe she never did. It's all about her. Jasmine only loves herself. I think she's been planning something bigger all along. Something with Taylor. She doesn't want me or you in the way because we're threats to her ambition." Ambition. The word hung between us like a blade. "But why me?" I asked, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've done nothing to her. I don't want anything to do with her plans. Why would she want to finish me?" Xavier's gaze softened, though his words were sharp. "Because you're the only one who stands in her way. You'd never let her or Taylor harm me, and she knows that. You're a fighter, Caddy. You're everything she's not. Loyal, selfless, and strong." I wanted to argue, to brush off his words as exaggeration. But deep down, I knew he was right. I would protect him, no matter what. Even if I was still angry with him. Even if our connection felt strained. "Yes," I finally said, my voice low. "That's true. But it doesn't make it any easier to stomach." Xavier nodded, his eyes searching mine. "We'll figure this out. You will." The drive back to the orphanage was silent, the kind of silence that leaves you alone with your thoughts. When we arrived, Xavier walked me to the gate, his posture rigid and unreadable. "Be careful, Caddy," he said softly. "Jasmine is dangerous." I nodded but didn't respond. There were too many questions swirling in my mind, and none of them had answers yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were restless, and my body wouldn't stay still. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jasmine's golden werewolf eyes flashing with rage. What was she hiding? By morning, I was resolved. I needed answers. I dressed quickly, pulling on a simple sweater and jeans. The day was brisk, and the orphanage grounds were quiet. I slipped out unnoticed, my steps light and deliberate. Jasmine's trail wasn't hard to pick up. She had a routine, one I'd studied carefully. I followed her from a distance, keeping to the shadows. She moved confidently, her posture giving nothing away. But I knew better now. Jasmine was a master manipulator, and her confidence wasn't a shield, it was a weapon. The truth started to unravel as I watched her interactions. She wasn't the grieving, loving wife she had claimed to be. I saw her meeting with Taylor in secret, their conversation heated and intense. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. "Never loved him," Jasmine hissed, her voice sharp and cutting. Xavier was just a step in my plan. Taylor smirked, leaning against a tree. And Caddy? She's in the way, Jasmine replied. She's too loyal to him. She'll never stop protecting him. And me? Taylor asked, his tone teasing but his eyes cold. Jasmine's laugh was dry and humorless. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not doing this for you. You're just my backup. Once Xavier and Caddy are gone, the pack will have no choice but to follow us. My stomach churned as their words sank in. Jasmine didn't love Xavier. She didn't even love Taylor. This was all about power, control, and ambition. And now, I knew the truth. Xavier led me to orphanage. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden hue over the orphanage grounds as I sat on the worn wooden bench outside. The air carried a chill that made my sweater feel too thin, but my mind was too preoccupied to notice. Xavier arrived not long after, his familiar figure emerging from the path that led to the forest. His stride was purposeful, yet there was a softness in his expression that hinted at concern. He sat beside me, the bench creaking under his weight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the small garden the kids and I had worked on the previous summer, its blooms now replaced with frost-bitten stems. "What's on your mind?" Xavier finally asked, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, my lips pressing into a thin line. "Jasmine and Taylor," I said bluntly. "They're a threat, not just to you and me, but to everything I care about. They'll stop at nothing, and we need to figure out what's next." Xavier nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll face them together, no matter what comes." His words carried a weight that settled in my heart. I believed him, but the reality of what together meant still felt distant. Before I could respond, he shifted closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "Caddy," he said softly, almost hesitantly. "You know how I feel about you. I don't care about the past or what's happened between us. I love you, and I want to be with you." I looked away, my gaze landing on a lone bird perched on the garden fence, its feathers puffed up against the cold. "Xavier," I began, my voice steady but firm. "You've said this before, and I've given you my answer. I can't. Not because I don't care about you, but because my life is here. This orphanage, these kids, they're my responsibility. They're my heart." He sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I understand," he said, though his tone hinted at disappointment. We sat in silence again, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Xavier left. That night, as I was tucking the kids into bed, a strange stillness settled over the orphanage. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath. I moved from room to room, checking on each child, their tiny bodies curled up under blankets. Then, the stillness shattered. The front door burst open with a deafening crash, and snarls echoed through the hallways. I froze for a split second before instinct took over. I raced toward the sound, my heart racing as I saw them, Jasmine and a group of shifters, their eyes glowing with malice. Panic surged through me. They were here to destroy everything. I wanted to transform, to fight back with every ounce of strength I had, but the thought of revealing my secret to the kids and the orphanage staff held me back. I couldn't risk it. The shifters began tearing through the orphanage, their claws ripping into walls and furniture. The destruction was fast and merciless, and they were moving closer to the children's rooms. Desperate, I grabbed a metal rod from the storage closet and charged at them, swinging with all my might. I managed to knock one shifter off balance, but it wasn't enough. They outnumbered me, and I was quickly overpowered. Just as I thought all hope was lost, a deafening roar shook the room. I turned to see a massive, silver-colored shifter barreling through the doorway. His movements were powerful and precise, taking down the enemy shifters with ease. It took me a moment to realize who it was. Taylor. My shock was mirrored by the other shifters, who hesitated just long enough for Taylor to gain the upper hand. I quickly grabbed my phone and called Xavier. "Now," I said breathlessly. Within moments, Xavier arrived with his pack, their combined strength overwhelming the attackers. The battle was short but intense, and soon Jasmine and her shifters were retreating into the night. The orphanage was in ruins, but the children were safe. As I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to process everything, Taylor approached me. He had shifted back into his human form, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low but steady. "About everything. I let my pride and ambition blind me. I thought I wanted power, but it's not worth losing the people who matter." I stared at him, struggling to believe his words. Why the sudden change of heart? "Because I see now what I've done," he replied. "I don't want to destroy Xavier. He's my friend, even if I've done everything to prove otherwise. And you?" He hesitated, his gaze softening. "You didn't deserve any of this." Xavier stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you're serious about making things right, there's only one way to prove it. You need to take down Jasmine." Taylor didn't flinch. "I will. You have my word." Xavier crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "We'll see." I took a deep breath, my mind racing as I tried to piece together a plan. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smart. Taylor, Jasmine still trusts you. That's our advantage. You'll pretend to be on her side, but when the time comes, you'll lead us to her." Taylor nodded. "Understood." Xavier exchanged a glance with Taylor, the tension between them still palpable. But for now, there was a truce. As they left to prepare, I stood alone in the wrecked orphanage. Despite the chaos, a small part of me felt hopeful. Taylor's redemption might be the key to ending this once and for all. The morning light streamed through the curtains, painting soft golden patterns on the floor of my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with Taylor's name, and my stomach tightened. I picked up the call, holding the phone to my ear. "Hello?" "Caddy," Taylor's voice came through, calm but firm. "It's done. I've convinced Jasmine." I straightened up, gripping the phone tighter. "What did she say?" "She's agreed to attack," Taylor explained. "I told her that tonight. We'll lure you and Xavier deep into the forest. I made her believe that I've rallied a group of shifters who'll stay hidden near the trees, ready to strike. She's completely bought it." Relief washed over me, and I couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at my lips. "That's perfect, Taylor. You've done well." "There's no turning back now," he said. "She trusts me, and I'll make sure she walks right into our trap. But you need to be ready." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "We will be. Thank you, Taylor." He hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'll see you tonight." Then the call ended. I stared at the phone in my hand for a second, letting the weight of the plan sink in. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for. Jasmine was finally going to face the consequences of her betrayal. Without wasting another second, I called Xavier. He picked up almost immediately. "Caddy," he said, his voice steady. "What's the news?" "Taylor's done it," I told him, unable to hide the satisfaction in my tone. "Jasmine is convinced. She thinks they'll ambush us in the forest tonight with a group of shifters." Xavier let out a low chuckle. "That's great. Taylor's proving himself again." "He's sticking to the plan perfectly," I added. But we need to make sure we're prepared. This has to go smoothly.
It will,
Xavier assured me. I've already informed my pack. We're ready to end this. I took a deep breath, leaning back against the headboard. Good. Let's finish this once and for all. I'll see you tonight, he said, his voice carrying a determined edge. Be ready, I reminded him. I've been ready for this since the moment Jasmine turned on us, he replied. She won't get away this time. After we hung up, I placed the phone on the nightstand and stood up, pacing the room. My mind raced with a mix of emotions: relief, anticipation, and a flicker of doubt. Could we really trust Taylor? He seemed genuine, but the stakes were too high to let our guard down. I walked over to the window, pushing the curtains aside. Outside, the children played in the yard, their laughter ringing out like music. This place, these kids, they were my world. And tonight, I would fight to protect them. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock feeling like an eternity. I busied myself with chores around the orphanage, but my thoughts kept drifting to the plan. By the time evening rolled around, I was restless. I went to the backyard, where the first hints of twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and I closed my eyes for a moment, grounding myself. This was it. By the time night fully settled in, I was ready. I had already informed the staff at the orphanage to keep the children safe and locked indoors. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette both foreboding and familiar. Xavier's eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of concern.
You okay?
He asked. I nodded. I am. Let's stick to the plan. He gave a sharp nod, turning to address his pack.
Stay hidden until I give the signal. We'll take her down quickly.
The pack moved into position, their movements swift and soundless. This is the end, Jasmine, I thought to myself, steeling my resolve. Tonight, we would finish what she started, and with Taylor's help, we would win. The evening air carried a strange calm as I stood by the window of the orphanage, staring at the forest in the distance. My phone sat on the table beside me, the screen lighting up with Taylor's name. I took a steady breath and answered, holding the phone close to my ear. So, when is she coming to the forest? I asked, my voice steady, though my fingers gripped the edge of the table tightly. Taylor's response was quick, his voice low.
Jasmine will be there at 8 p.m., along with me.
I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I'm ready, I said firmly. He didn't say anything else, just hung up. I placed the phone down, staring at it for a moment longer before turning away. There was no turning back now. I walked to my room, grabbing my jacket and tying my hair back into a loose braid. My old friends, all shifters, had agreed to help, and I felt a renewed sense of strength knowing I wasn't alone. The orphanage was quiet, the children already asleep, their peaceful breaths filling the halls. By the time Xavier's car pulled up outside, I was ready. He stepped out, dressed in dark clothes, his expression sharp and focused. The soft glow of the orphanage lights reflected off his face, and for a moment I was struck by how determined he looked.
You ready?
He asked, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Let's go. The drive to the forest was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. I glanced at Xavier out of the corner of my eye, his jaw set as he stared ahead. He looked like a man with a mission, and I couldn't help but feel a spark of admiration. When we arrived, the forest was cloaked in darkness, the tall trees casting long shadows. My old friends were already there, waiting in silence. They greeted me with nods, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. Xavier's eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of concern.
You okay? He asked.
I nodded. I am. Let's stick to the plan. He gave a sharp nod, turning to address his pack.
Stay hidden until I give the signal. We'll take her down quickly.
The pack moved into position, their movements swift and soundless. Everyone knows the plan? I asked, my voice low. They all nodded. Some of them moved silently into the trees, taking up hidden positions. A few stayed close to Xavier and me, their presence a silent reassurance. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. I stood beside Xavier, the two of us watching the forest edge intently. The wind rustled the leaves, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. And then, it happened. The tall grasses at the forest's edge shifted, parting as footsteps approached. I straightened, my muscles tensing as I caught sight of two figures emerging from the darkness. Jasmine and Taylor. Jasmine was in her human form, her long dark hair falling in waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress, the fabric fluttering slightly in the breeze. Her face, however, wasn't what I expected. She looked soft, vulnerable, even. She stopped a few feet away from us, her gaze locked on mine. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she surprised me. "Caddy," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry." I blinked, caught off guard by her words. "I've been horrible," she continued, her hands clasped in front of her. "These past few days, I don't even recognize myself. I've done things I'm not proud of, things that haunt me." She paused, her eyes glistening. "I regret it, deeply. Taylor told me to attack you and Xavier when you'd be alone, but I can't do it. I won't. Not anymore." My breath hitched, and I felt Xavier stiffen beside me. She took a step closer, her voice steady despite the emotion in it. "The truth is, Taylor isn't the only one at fault. He's made mistakes, yes, but I've been worse. Much worse. I've let my anger and ambition blind me, and I hate myself for it." I didn't know what to say. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I glanced at Taylor, who stood silently beside her, his face unreadable. Jasmine's gaze met mine again, pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I probably never will. But I promise you, Caddy, I will never hurt you or Xavier again." Her words felt genuine, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that lingered in my chest. People don't change overnight, and Jasmine had proven herself untrustworthy before. I squared my shoulders, meeting her gaze with a steady one of my own. "I can't trust you," I said, my voice firm. "If you're really serious about this, you'll have to prove it. Do something that shows me you've changed." Jasmine didn't hesitate. She nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll do whatever you ask," she said. "Right here, right now. Tell me what to do." I faltered, caught off guard by her response. My mind raced, trying to think of something that would test her sincerity. Beside her, Taylor's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his face. "I'll need a moment," I said finally, buying myself some time. Jasmine nodded again, stepping back slightly. "Take all the time you need." I glanced at Xavier, who met my gaze with a questioning look. Neither of us had expected this, and I could tell he was just as thrown off as I was. Taylor, on the other hand, seemed completely stunned by Jasmine's sudden change of heart. He stayed silent, his eyes darting between her and me as if trying to make sense of it all. As I stood there, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. If Jasmine was telling the truth, this could change everything. But if she wasn't, we couldn't afford to let our guard down. For now, All I could do was hope I made the right choice. The forest felt still, like the calm before a storm. My focus was locked on Taylor and Jasmine, their expressions giving nothing away, but I could feel the tension bubbling under the surface. Xavier was hidden somewhere in the trees, and my friends were scattered, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That's when Fury emerged. He came out of nowhere, stepping from the shadows like a ghost. His movements were slow, deliberate, and his face carried a grim seriousness that made everyone pause. The moonlight reflected off the weapon in his hand, a sharp, gleaming thing that looked as deadly as his narrowed eyes. "What is this?" I asked, my voice steady, though inside I worked to piece it together. Fury wasn't supposed to come out yet. Was he improvising? Fury pointed the weapon at me, his tone gruff and commanding. "Move, now!" Taylor's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Jasmine's lips twitched into something between confusion and amusement. Neither of them stepped forward. They just stood there, watching. "Fury, what are you doing?" I asked, letting my voice sharpen just enough to sound convincing. "I'm not taking chances," he said curtly. "Taylor's right. You need to be contained." The cold edge in his words sent a ripple through the group. Slowly, I raised my hands, taking a cautious step back. "Okay," I said softly. "Whatever you think is best." The cage stood ready a few feet away, its iron bars gleaming under the pale light. Fury motioned toward it with the weapon. "Inside," he barked. I hesitated, glancing at Taylor and Jasmine. They didn't move a muscle. Taylor smirked. Jasmine crossed her arms, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Fury kept the weapon steady as I stepped into the cage. The door creaked as he slammed it shut, locking it with a decisive click. "Happy now?" I asked, gripping the bars, my voice laced with annoyance. The forest was eerily quiet as the scene unfolded. I stood stiffly in the cage Fury had just locked me in, gripping the cold iron bars and staring at him as if he'd betrayed me. His expression was dark, menacing even, and he held the weapon as if he meant business. Taylor and Jasmine stood a few feet away, watching the drama unfold with amused looks on their faces. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, a smirk playing on her lips. Taylor folded his arms, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. Neither of them moved to help me. But that was fine. This was all part of the plan. Fury turned to them, waving the weapon lazily in my direction. "She's caged now," he said, his voice gruff. "You can do whatever you want with her." I bit the inside of my cheek, pretending to glare at him. Inside, I felt a twinge of satisfaction. Everything was going exactly how I had planned. Fury's fake betrayal was convincing enough to fool anyone, even me if I didn't know better. Taylor took a step forward, his lips curling into a smug smile. "That's more like it," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Caddy, you thought you could outsmart me? Look where you are now." I said nothing, letting the moment stretch as if I were frozen in shock. My fingers tightened around the bars for effect, and I cast a quick glance at Jasmine. She looked pleased, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Then, Taylor tilted his head back slightly and howled. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and commanding. Moments later, 4 figures emerged from the shadows, his new pack. They were lean, strong, and predatory, their eyes scanning the scene as they approached. "You're done, Caddy," Taylor said, his voice cold. "You and Xavier. Tonight's your last night standing." I held my breath for a moment, watching his pack move closer. They were just steps away when everything shifted. The woods erupted in movement as dozens of figures emerged from the trees. My friends, the ones who had been hiding, charged forward with practiced precision. Their eyes blazed with determination, and their footsteps were silent, but deliberate. Taylor's smirk vanished instantly.
What?
He started, but he didn't get to finish. Before he could react, my friends swarmed his pack, taking them down with swift, coordinated strikes. The sound of snarls, growls, and scuffling filled the air as my team overpowered his with ease. Jasmine turned to run, but Fury stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He tossed the weapon aside. His act of betrayal dropped completely and unlocked the cage in one fluid motion.
You okay, Caddy?
Fury asked, his voice calm. I nodded, stepping out of the cage and brushing off my clothes. Perfectly fine, I said, meeting his eyes with a grateful smile. Taylor and Jasmine were stunned. It was as if they couldn't process what was happening. You planned this, Taylor said, his voice low and angry. I shrugged, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. What did you expect, Taylor? You think I'd trust you after everything you've done? You were a fool to believe I didn't have a backup plan. Jasmine hissed, her hands balling into fists. You're going to regret this, Caddy. I don't think so, I said, my voice sharp. Xavier emerged from the trees then, his presence commanding as he joined the fight. He didn't even glance at Jasmine as he walked past her, heading straight for me. Nice plan, he said, giving me a quick nod. Thanks, I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. Now, let's finish this. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. My friends were relentless, their loyalty and strength unmatched. Taylor's pack didn't stand a chance, and one by one they were taken down. Taylor and Jasmine fought back fiercely, but it wasn't enough. Xavier and I charged at them together, our movements synchronized as we drove them back. Taylor stumbled, his breaths ragged as he collapsed onto the forest floor. He was bleeding heavily, his strength fading fast. Jasmine fared no better. A fallen tree had pinned her to the ground, her attempts to free herself growing weaker with each passing moment. I stood over Taylor, watching as he struggled to breathe. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. He had once pretended to be my friend, and a part of me had wanted to believe he could change, but tonight had proven otherwise.
Caddy.
Taylor's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes flickering up to meet mine. I said nothing, my gaze steady. There was nothing left to say. Xavier walked over to where Jasmine lay trapped. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperation. Xavier, she started, but he cut her off with a shake of his head.
It doesn't matter anymore,
he said simply, turning away from her. He glanced at me, his eyes softening slightly.
Let's go.
I hesitated, looking at Jasmine one last time. If you want to talk to her, you can, I said, my voice quiet. Xavier shook his head.
There's nothing to talk about.
I nodded, accepting his decision. The forest fell silent once more as my friends gathered around. I turned to them, my chest swelling with gratitude. Thank you, I said, my voice carrying through the trees. I couldn't have done this without you. They nodded, their faces lighting up with smiles. One by one, they faded back into the shadows, leaving only Xavier and me standing in the clearing. As we walked back toward the orphanage, Xavier spoke up.
You were right, Caddy. Taylor was never supposed to be trusted.
I always knew it, I said with a small smile. This was all part of the plan, to bring Taylor and Jasmine here and end this once and for all. He looked at me, his expression filled with admiration.
You're really something else, Caddy. Strong and smart. They never stood a chance.
I smiled at his words, feeling a warmth spread through me. Thanks, Xavier. When we reached the orphanage, Xavier left, giving me a final nod before disappearing into the night. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him go, before transforming back into my human form and stepping inside. The children were waiting for me, their innocent faces lighting up as I joined them for dinner. Their laughter filled the room, washing away the tension of the night. Later, as I lay in bed, I felt a deep sense of relief. The battle was over, and the orphanage was safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, I slept with a calm and relaxed mind. The sun filtered through the thin curtains of the orphanage office as I sat reviewing the day's plans. Mornings were always busy here, organizing meals, arranging activities for the kids, and making sure everything ran smoothly. I was just wrapping up when one of the staff members approached me, her face lit up with excitement. "Caddy," she began, clasping her hands. "We have a new member joining us today. He's a man, and he said he wants to serve the orphanage. He's even offered to help us financially." Her words caught my attention immediately. "That's wonderful," I said, smiling. "The more people we have who care about these kids, the better their lives will be." She nodded eagerly. "He's in the main hall if you want to meet him." Curiosity piqued. I headed toward the hall, my thoughts buzzing with gratitude for this mysterious newcomer. But when I walked in, my steps faltered. Standing there, arranging boxes of supplies, was none other than Xavier. I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing. "Xavier?" I called out, my voice rising in surprise. "What are you doing here?" He glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Sorry, madam," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I have a lot of work to do. We'll talk later." "Wait," I said, stepping closer. "Are you here to join us?" He nodded, not even looking at me as he shifted a box from one side of the room to the other. "Yes." And just like that, he busied himself again, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. Throughout the day, I found myself watching him. He worked tirelessly, helping staff members with chores, playing with the kids, and even repairing a broken swing in the playground. Whenever I tried to approach him, though, he brushed me off with some excuse about being busy. It was infuriating. By late afternoon, I couldn't help but fume silently. If Xavier wasn't here for me, then why was he here? But deep down, I couldn't ignore the truth. Of course, he was here because of me. Yet, his indifference confused me. Was he trying to prove something? As the day wore on, my frustration mixed with an odd sense of admiration. Despite my irritation, it was hard not to notice how naturally he fit into the orphanage. The kids adored him, following him around like ducklings. The staff kept thanking him for his help. He even managed to fix the old kitchen faucet that had been leaking for weeks. In the evening, one of the staff members approached me with another update. "Caddy, did you hear? Xavier's arranged a party for the kids tonight. He's inviting everyone in the orphanage." "A party?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Really?" "Yes," she said, her excitement infectious. "He's already set up decorations and ordered food. It's so kind of him." I managed a small smile, though my thoughts were a swirl of confusion. "That's great. I'm really glad he's supporting the orphanage like this." When the party began, the kids were buzzing with joy. The dining hall had been transformed with string lights and balloons. Tables were lined with snacks, and music played softly in the background. The children danced and laughed, their faces glowing with happiness. Xavier stood near the center of the room, chatting with a group of staff members. He looked different tonight, not just because he'd traded his usual rugged appearance for a crisp shirt and dark jeans, but because there was an ease in his demeanor. His laugh carried across the room, warm and genuine, as he helped a small boy balance a plate of cake. I watched him from a distance, a mix of emotions swirling in my chest. "Caddy!" One of the older kids tugged at my sleeve, pulling me out of my thoughts. "You should come dance." "I think I'll sit this one out," I said with a laugh, patting her head. But my eyes kept drifting back to Xavier. It was hard not to. He had a way of drawing attention without even trying, his presence commanding yet oddly comforting. When he finally glanced my way, our eyes met for a brief moment. I expected him to look away, but instead, he held my gaze. Something unspoken passed between us. An acknowledgement, perhaps. As the party continued, the staff and kids kept praising him. "Xavier's amazing," I overheard one of the staff members say. "He's done so much in just one day." By the end of the evening, as the children began to tire and the music softened, Xavier approached me for the first time since the morning. "Caddy?" he said, his tone quieter now. "Yes?" I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "I hope the kids enjoyed the party," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "They did," I said, glancing around at the smiling faces. "Thank you for organizing it. It means a lot." He nodded, his expression unreadable again. "Good night, Caddy." And with that, he walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. The party was in full swing, and the energy in the room was electric. The kids were laughing, running around with balloons, while the staff mingled, sipping on punch and exchanging stories. I stood near the edge of the room, chatting with a group of volunteers, though my attention kept drifting back to Xavier. He was standing by the snack table, surrounded by a few women who had clearly taken an interest in him. They were laughing a little too loudly at his every word, their smiles lingering just a second too long. He didn't seem overly engaged, but his polite demeanor kept the conversation going. I told myself it didn't bother me. Xavier had every right to talk to whoever he wanted. I even convinced myself to look away, focusing on the laughter of the children instead. But my gaze betrayed me, sneaking back to him every few moments. Then, one of the women, a tall, elegant lady named Sona, stepped closer to Xavier. Her red dress shimmered under the soft lights as she tilted her head and smiled at him. "Would you like to dance with me?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough charm to make it clear this wasn't a casual request. Xavier hesitated. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on me. I froze, pretending to laugh at something one of the volunteers said, though I hadn't heard a word of their conversation. I busied myself adjusting a flower arrangement on the table, as if I couldn't care less about what was happening. When I glanced back, Xavier had taken her hand and led her to the dance floor. A pang of something, jealousy perhaps, tightened in my chest, but I pushed it down, reminding myself of my own decisions. I had chosen this path, to dedicate my life to the orphanage and the children. I'd told myself I didn't want to marry or fall in love again. This was my life now, and I wasn't going to let a man, even Xavier, change that. Still, watching them dance wasn't easy. Sona moved gracefully, her laugh soft and melodic. Xavier was reserved, his movements steady but distant. It wasn't like he was enjoying himself too much, at least, that's what I told myself. But the way she looked up at him, her eyes sparkling, made my stomach twist. I turned away and joined a group of kids at a table, helping them stack their dessert plates. Their giggles were infectious, and for a moment, I felt like I could ignore what was happening behind me, until Sona insisted Xavier have dinner with her. I tried not to watch as they sat together, their plates filled with the party's buffet. Xavier seemed hesitant at first, but Sona's persistence won out. She leaned closer to him as they talked, her hand occasionally brushing his arm. It was too much. Excusing myself, I slipped away to the washroom, needing a moment to breathe. The cool tiles and soft hum of the lights offered some solace. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to shake the knot of emotions that had settled in my chest. Get a grip, Caddy, I muttered under my breath. You're stronger than this. I splashed some water on my face and took a deep breath, deciding then and there that I'd leave the party. There was no point staying if all I was going to do was torture myself. But as I turned to leave, the door opened, and there he was, Xavier. Our eyes met briefly, but he didn't stop. He didn't say a word. He walked past me like I wasn't even there, heading straight into the men's side of the washroom. The audacity of it stunned me for a moment. Then, anger bubbled up, hot and sharp. If he wanted to ignore me, fine, I could do the same. I left the washroom and walked back into the party with my head held high. If Xavier thought he could get under my skin, he was mistaken. Back in the hall, I threw myself into the festivities. I danced with the kids, laughed with the staff, and even joined a group for a game of charades. Every time I caught sight of Xavier, now talking to another woman, I forced myself to smile brighter and laugh louder. Let him see that I didn't care. By the time the party started winding down, I was exhausted but proud of myself. I had kept my composure, stayed true to my decision, and refused to let Xavier, or my feelings, get the better of me. But as I looked across the room and saw him helping a little boy carry a balloon, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder what he was really thinking. The party was over, and the orphanage had settled into silence. I was exhausted, but my mind was far from calm. As I prepared for bed, thoughts of Xavier kept creeping in. He had been so distant, like a completely different person. It was unsettling. I slipped out of my party dress and into a comfortable nightgown. The cool fabric was a welcome relief after the evening's bustle. I washed my face at the small sink near my bed, the cold water refreshing against my skin. But as I climbed into bed and nestled under the covers, I couldn't shake the uneasiness. My bed was near the window, and as I laid there, staring out into the night, I spotted something. A figure moving through the woods, just barely visible in the moonlight. It looked like Xavier. I sat up slowly, my curiosity outweighing my fatigue. Why was he out there? Without a second thought, I slipped on my slippers and quietly made my way outside, careful not to wake anyone. The night air was crisp, and the faint sounds of crickets filled the silence as I followed the direction he'd gone. But Xavier was gone. I looked around, the shadows of the trees playing tricks on my eyes. Just as I was about to give up, I saw two figures ahead, a man and a woman, close, intimate. I moved closer, my footsteps light on the forest floor. The woman was the same one who had danced with Xavier at the party. My heart skipped as I stepped closer, but when I saw the man's face, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It wasn't Xavier. Embarrassed by my assumptions, I turned back toward the orphanage. As I climbed the steps to my room, I wondered why I even cared so much. But when I opened the door, I froze. Xavier was sitting on the edge of my bed, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You scared me," I said, shutting the door behind me. "I'm leaving in the morning," he said, his tone flat. I frowned. "Leaving? Where? I thought you joined us permanently." "I found the love of my life," he said, standing and looking me straight in the eye. "And the interesting part is, she doesn't plan to stay single forever." The taunt hit me like a slap. I crossed my arms, refusing to show how much it stung. "Well, you know I don't have time to flirt with every person I meet like you do. I have responsibilities. I'll be just fine staying single." He smirked. "You sound jealous." "Jealous?" I shot back, my voice rising. "I think you're the jealous one. You came here to take my place at the orphanage, didn't you?" "Maybe I am jealous," he said, his voice quieter now. "That's why I'm leaving, so you can stay happy." "Go ahead," I said, my voice sharp. "Make some kids with your new love." His eyes narrowed. She's attractive. Hot, even. Unlike you. That was it. Unlike me, I repeated, stepping closer. And how will you manage? You seem to be juggling plenty of women already. I prefer 5 at a time, he said with a grin. The slap came before I could think twice. His head turned slightly from the impact, but when he looked back at me, his expression wasn't angry. It was something else entirely. Before I could step away, his hands were on my face, his lips crushing mine in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was raw, deep, and completely unexpected. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. But then something inside me snapped, and I kissed him back with everything I had. My hands tangled in his hair as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me close. Time seemed to stop as we lost ourselves in each other. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his voice low. I love you, Caddy. I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, my heart racing. Morning came too soon. The sunlight filtered through the window as Xavier knelt by my bed, holding a small box. Caddy, he said, his voice steady but his eyes full of emotion. Will you marry me? I stared at him, the question hanging in the air. No, I said finally, my expression serious. His face fell, disappointment clear in his eyes. Then I smiled. I'm joking. Of course, I'll marry you. The relief and joy on his face were undeniable as he pulled me into a tight embrace. I love you, I whispered, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years, and for the first time in a long time, I felt complete.